Can I take the liberty as Jay is making his way to the table? I'd like to introduce this gentleman who never seeks the spotlight and is usually, behind the scenes, but has been on the EFPBC, Jay, for at least 12 years.
2006.
2006.
Bros.
And when the EFPBC really gets into the weeds on school projects, it is a real heavy lift. And Jay is, from time to time, people miss meetings. I've never known Jay to miss a meeting. He's just very, very insightful. Really appreciate his demeanor, especially when the going gets tough and there are difficult problems to solve. And sometimes tempers can flare. Jay is just an absolute steady hand. Jay is the vice president of Nardone Electric Corporation, so he's a very experienced institutional contractor and has a lot of familiarity with institutional building design and construction, as well as cost estimating and so forth. So Jay is someone who kind of lives it and breathes it every day. And his firm has also done some work even here in town, so that's always appreciated. So I'm glad that Jay had an interest in being with us. He's had a chance. Jay, you've seen the 130-page report. Yes. You've seen the presentation on Thursday. And I in particular thought this was a great opportunity. With Lynch beginning to get started, we're going to see more of the EFPBC. We will have community meetings. We will engage a programmer and a visioning consultant and so on. So it's a great opportunity really for the committee to kind of put a name with a face as Lynch gets started. And Jay, my understanding is you certainly have some observations that you could make about not just in general design and construction, but working with the MSBA.
Right.
Thank you, Karen.
I think you hit it both. If we're going to do the project, and it is needed, I would say, from all these projects since Ambrose dealing with the MSBA, they're not going to fund the project, and it becomes a mess the budgeting, try to break out an item that isn't funded and being part of an override or whatever. Even dealing with them in general, square footages, everything. If we could take this project away from the Lynch, there's a lot of advantages. They hit a lot of them on Tepe's presentation as far as security and other areas like that, and restoring a beautiful site like the Carriage House to get that out there if it does fit. If it works program-wise, and get it away from the Lynch and get it out of the MSBA and let us control it with the school committee and the EFPBC, there's a great, you can't ask for a better committee of knowledge and get it going.
And on that note, Jay, so obviously if the school committee should decide to locate central office with Lynch, the EFPBC has a role, because I think, as we all understand, that's basically our school building committee. But I want to give you the opportunity to sort of share with the school committee if the preference is to go to the Carriage House. Can you sort of speak to the EFPBC sort of interest and ability to manage that as well? We had some EFPBC members at the high school last week, so that's why I brought it up.
We have the ability. We can do it. We meet whenever necessary, every other week right now, but we've gone to weekly when we have to. We've been through plenty of these projects already, from start to finish. So bringing it on is not an issue. Going through the budgetary and taking it from where you've left it, it's not a problem with taking it on. And it, quite frankly, would be easier for us to man that as its own project than trying to fit it in with the Lynch. Just going through the high school with dealing with the MSBA on gym and areas that they didn't agree with the square footages we were dealing with, classrooms, stuff that was existing. Made no sense at all that they wouldn't fund a less expensive classroom just because it was more square footage. The rhyme or reason doesn't make sense. So for us, it would be easier to get this out of the Lynch and run on its own and get it going too. The timeline would be much quicker to get it underway.
So I thought with Jay here tonight, there was another point that I failed to make last week that I think is an important one to make, that typically every once in a while the school committee advocates for and welcomes funding for certain key capital projects, but we only take it so far. We just sort of begin to move the football. So most recently this was at McCall. where we'd had our phase 1 and phase 2 expansion. So in that instance, the school committee, and this was coming right out of the master plan, we actually sought funding and we engaged an architect, Flansburgh, built a working group that included representatives from the EFPBC. But the EFPBC had its hands full at that time kind of wrapping up the high school project. So the school committee did a space programming exercise, did a schematic exercise to get sort of a vision of what this project could be. Will it work? How might it fit? What might it cost? And then we kind of used that progress, which was really a step beyond schematics. It was really quite detailed, to then go and advocate for funding. So for phase 1, we did not need a debt exclusion override. That was a little easier to manage. That was about $1.5 million. For phase 2, that was closer to 11. But there was a handoff to the EFPBC, and my expectation is that should the school committee opt to designate the carriage house, that remind the committee, and this is actually part of our discussion later tonight under capital and building projects update, we're asking for an additional $57,000 for some supplemental funding to basically take what is a schematic design with a cost estimate, take it one more step further to be especially confident of those numbers. If there's opportunities to reduce the cost, we would do that. But I really see that exercise as something that the EFPBC can help with, because there are engineers and architects there around the table. That is the handoff, frankly. If there should be interest and support of moving it forward, we would kind of basically take what TAPE has done now and then ask the EFPBC to move it forward that one additional step, which I think would be helpful, although the big lift, of course, is figuring out how do you pay to actually do the work. But should we be successful there, you certainly would want the EFPBC to be familiar with the project and the documents and so on.
And make sure the systems, like you said, the architects, engineers, mechanical, go through and make sure we're getting what we really want for the end use of the school committee and offices.
So Karen, Jay's seen a lot of projects through on our behalf in Winchester, and he's happy to take questions from school committee members, superintendent, anyone. If there are questions, whether it's about a carriage house option or maybe just thoughts about conceptually working with the MSBA on Lynch or all of the above.
Okay, so I will open it up to questions from our members. Mr. Hopcroft.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I don't actually have a lot of questions, because I feel like what I've heard has been stacked very much in the direction of the carriage house. But I guess that begs the question of, are there reasons that you can see why the carriage house wouldn't make sense that haven't been presented, or why Lynch would be a better solution? Because it feels like the preponderance goes the other way.
I don't see anything why Lynch would be a better option. I mean, of course, a newer building than the carriage house would always be a better option with, a shell that we're renting a shell, but that doesn't exist in Winchester. A vacant office or a shell build-out where it's already up would be a better option, but we are given somewhat of a frame to deal with. We're dealing with some sort of an envelope. The condition of it is in the report. It's in the ground. It has a foundation. There's a lot of advantages to it. I don't see any advantage with going into the Lynch. Just putting an office in a school and bringing the traffic security and dealing with the MSBA, I don't see. It's the same square footage. It would be added to the school, or it would be added in the carriage house. So I don't see any advantage to put in the Lynch. But if you're saying the carriage house, is it the only option? If we had a commercial building in town that could be used for office space, that'd be a great option too, but it just doesn't exist in our town that I know of anyways.
Thank you.
So I was just going to request, Ms. Bolognese, that could Mr. Nardone please just stay with us during our discussion, so if there are questions that we come up, because I think we may seek his opinion on some things that we're discussing as we move along through our discussion of Carriage House and Lynch.
Yes, that is what I was hoping.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's not a problem.
Perfect.
You mean tonight or moving forward?
Right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, so
Right.
we should probably be clear. I mean, we said this last week that although we could make a decision tonight, we don't have to make a decision tonight, and we certainly wanted to welcome some public feedback. I want to acknowledge, and maybe other questions have come through the superintendent or the chair. we've received, that I'm aware of, I think 7 questions in writing. They're great questions. I mean, some of them are, detailed questions about the value of one thing versus the value at Lynch, some MSBA questions about foundation and so forth. So what I hope we can do is just sort of collect those, fire those back to the team, and then perhaps, Ms. Bergstrom, we sort of incorporate those questions and the answers into the packet for the meeting on the 28th. And that way, members of the public who are asking questions can be confident that we saw the questions and we have some answers, and we're all just that much better sort of informed, when we make a decision. Can I just also say I didn't know that Mr. Lemanage had sent in a statement, so that's nice of him to do that, but I just want to clarify for the record, I appreciate the high five from Jack, but just to be clear, I feel like all along, really what I've been doing as sort of the legacy school committee member is just ensuring that we were following through on a process that from time to time we've said we would do. So, what we're doing now is what we said at town meeting in the spring of 18 we needed to do, and when we went to town meeting and asked for the money to do that, it's because we had said at the master plan level this would be our preferred option, but we need to study it carefully, and we need to do a space program. And even once we do that, we need to compare it to a Lynch or a Morocco, because we were hopeful that someday we'd be doing that with the MSBA. And even that exercise, at the master plan came from conversations in 2012. So I feel like all along, I've simply, from time to time, wanted to be sure that we're kind of staying the course. And I think if the outcome of TAP A's evaluation had been that the carriage house would cost $12 million and Lynch would cost $3 million, I don't think we'd be sitting here having this conversation right now.
Right.
So, cost matters, timeliness matters. Is it a fit? Does it really work like we thought it would? That obviously matters. And so I think we really needed to have gone through that analysis. And now that we've done that, I think what we come away with is, on a construction cost basis, they seem to be very similar. From a timing point of view, they're kind of not. Again, we have to find the funding, but we could certainly pull off central office at the carriage house 2 years prior to Lynch. From a process point of view, one can argue Lynch is a little bit easier. I put that in air quotes because there's just one question. So for those who don't understand this, if the MSBA should agree that we could include central office in Lynch, it doesn't mean it's a separate ballot question. It's still one ballot question. It's one debt exclusion override. How we handle the accounting and everything, which Jay was describing how much he enjoyed at the high school, is really just something that the EFPBC and Meg White kind of have to work through. So I feel like the design team certainly came forward with all the information that we asked them to present to us, and it's kind of hard to push them a little further beyond what they've done, but we certainly continue to welcome questions, and as I said, I think we've gotten some good ones.
So I have a question I'm going to throw it out there to Mr. Nixon, Dr. Hackett, Mr. Nardone, whoever wants to take this one. So one of the concerns that I have heard about Lynch is that the central office would need to be attached to the Lynch building, and that might offer a security concern. I mentioned the other night, and I still have similar security concerns with Ambrose being so close to the carriage house. It's still within proximity of that building. I think the security concerns are just as valid at Ambrose as they are at Lynch. I'm wondering if it is part of an MSBA project at Lynch, though, does it have to be attached to the building? Or if there was space on the site, could it be a separate building on the same site built at the same time, the way the carriage house is at Ambrose?
So I'm happy to take my first crack at that, and would certainly ask Frank to weigh in because you've got a lot of MSBA experience in your other districts. So just to be clear, the security issue kind of plays in a couple of ways. In the first sense, and this goes back to conversations we had a couple of years ago, what I believe this committee is still unanimous on is that we wouldn't want to go back to the way it once was at Lynch, meaning that if you had to see Dr. Hackett and you were buzzed, if Aaron buzzed you in, you had a free run of the school.
Yep.
So that's the pre-Stoneham Douglas, pre-Newtown world, and we're not gonna do that again. So the consequence of that isn't that it's inherently wrong or dangerous, to have central office in a school building. It simply recognizes that it almost needs to be a building within a building. So when you say attached, one might look at a design solution and say, I see an elementary school and I see a central office and it looks detached. That might be how the design manifests itself. But it doesn't have to be. You might also have a scenario where it appears to be one building, there just happens to be a door over there. You go in that door, you find yourself in a sort of self-contained space program that addresses those kind of security issues. So that means no shared spaces, no common egress, entry points, bathrooms, vertical circulation and so forth. So this is why, Jay was saying it's 8,100 square feet, whether it's here or there. So that just sort of speaks to that issue. As far as whether or not the MSBA would permit us to do something separate, given their statements to us already and they've cautioned us that we should not assume that they will allow us to put it in the building. They'll think about it carefully. They do make that decision with some districts and with others they don't. I'd be surprised if they would allow us to build a separate, literally a separate physical plant for central office. I don't know that there's any precedent for that, but I've not asked them that question. I think that would just be really unusual. The architects, so we will have a Lynch update, I hope, on the 14th, but the submission deadline has come in, and we've actually had 10 submissions from some fantastic and talented design firms, so we're very excited by that. They understand, all of them, that we're looking at the central office question, and that it might be Lynch or it might be the carriage house. None of them have either suggested the separate concept or in terms of kind of presenting their relevant work have they shared with us, kind of what you're describing. The shorter answer is, I would have to ask them. I don't know, Dr. Hackett, what you would want to add.
It's a interesting question. I am not aware that has ever been done. And if you think about it, their interest is they build schools.
Right.
So if they were to allow us to put central office in the Lynch project, their interest in that is the impact on the actual school facility.
Right.
Everything from flow within the building to entries and exits to security to actual site. My guess would be that they would have the same interest if it was detached. So they're not going to pay for any of it anyway.
Correct.
There would be potentially some economies of scale or some cost saving that we might be able to tie the central offices into the heating plant, the HVAC system, the electrical system of the actual school. That would be separate. But whatever we do is going to be all locally funded anyway. I think their interest would be what would be the impact on the site, and that they would have a say
Right.
in terms of traffic flow, safety, utilization of the outside spaces, potentially any kind of just site work costs that might impact on the Lynch School project. So I guess the cleanest way that I would think about it, and we can certainly ask the question. First, I'm not aware that it's been done. But they don't care about how much money, what it looks like, if it's anywhere else, even if it's on the same site, but they do care about the school and making sure that any kind of impact is not does not affect the school in a negative way.
So that would lead directly into a follow-up question for me then. So a cost we haven't figured into the carriage house then, if we're self-funding it and building a building there, is we would have to then fund studies on traffic flow, security, and all the effect on the Ambrose building if we're going to put it at the carriage house. Whereas if we put it at Lynch, all those costs of worrying about the new building in the central office would be built into the MSBA project?
I don't know the answer to that directly, but I'm assuming that they would peel off a portion, some kind of percentage of the cost of anything that we do that they could tie directly back to the central office construction.
Right.
And all of that would then be at a premium that MSBA would charges for any kind of any project that they're involved in. I say premium from the standpoint that they are very specific about.
Right.
Right.
But it's costs we haven't considered in this total project cost that we received from TAPE the other day, because we would still need to do the security assessment, the traffic flow assessment, all of the things that would be part of a new school building project. would need to be done for this new building at Carriage House
I'll
as
step out
well.
of that one because I don't know the local
So I'm
requirements.
not sure I follow you totally, but so I think there are two things maybe we could clarify. The question that was posed to Charlie last week was if we'd done a traffic study. So that literally means like you have counters out there, so you're looking at how many cars are coming in and out, and where's the peak period, what's the peak flow, and so they have not done that. In this instance, as a part of his response, though, he was sort of speaking to how many people are reasonably expected in that building, when do they come into work in
Right.
the morning. And what he was trying to express is that he didn't see that was going to have a significant impact on pickup and drop off. What I am interested in, though, is I think we would need to understand how does pickup and drop off work at Ambrose. And as I think you're aware, there has been about a year and a half ago, the town got a risk assessment done of the entire town. That includes the schools.
Yep.
And there are some recommendations from that consultant, which I only learned about recently, but through the capital process. So I think
Right.
we'll certainly look forward to having conversations with Dr. Hackett and Peter and others, and maybe bring that forward to school committee. But there are some recommendations in there about sort of formalizing pickup, drop-off procedures, and I think as a consequence of kind of looking at that, if there are things that we can do to improve that, we certainly would want to. I want to be clear, though, that TAP-A did look at, because this was in the master plan, this suggestion that could we find another curb cut, for instance, off of High Street, separate and apart from the one that we have at Ambrose. So Warner Larson, who's the landscape architect, who was the landscape architect on VO, looked at that actually very, very carefully. And the grades there are just very difficult. And if you simply stand on High Street and just look, you can sort of get it. The grades are tough. They looked at other alternatives in terms of moving through the site and felt that there just weren't really any viable solutions. However, we did commit to the society that given the area that's kind of suggested by the lease for future parking expansion is the same area that they were separately exploring a few years ago, we would endeavor to work with them to come up with a plan that not only kind of maximizes the parking, but even within that, one needs to define parking and also drive lanes, right? So you actually have circulation in one area along one edge, or you don't. And that, I think, also has a sort of safety or security component to it. In other words, how you design that, given that there are students on campus, matters. And I think that would absolutely be, entertained. But I don't see that affecting the project cost, given the scale of the work.
Right, but I guess what I was hearing from Mr. Nardone, that he was seeing as a disadvantage, I see as an advantage, is that when you build a new building from scratch, and if the central office was on that site, that you would get all of these, you would be forced almost by the MSBA as part of the process to look at the impact of the central office on the school building. You would be required to look at the safety issues surrounding that. You're required to look at traffic flow. And we didn't include any of those kind of costs in our study plan for the carriage house. The impact on the Ambrose community, the impact on that educational environment, the impact on that traffic flow, the impact on all of those things that when we're building a building up from scratch, we're going to have to look at. But we should be doing it if we're putting essentially a new building on the Ambrose site, because right now it's the equivalent of an empty lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think, if I could interrupt, they did at the end of their budget have a lot of soft costs that come with a construction job, that those fees roll into. But rolling back to even our most recent job as the high school, the fields were not funded by MSBA.
Right.
And they drew right down the line as the architect's hours working on the field versus working on the high school. Even everything had to be broken down. So they, no matter where it went, they will not let it get covered as part of the job. So you're right, you have to make sure there's enough money in there. That's a very high level budget that they've done. I've gone through it a few times.
Mm-hmm.
There's give and take all over it, and that's the way they do it. It's square foot numbers. So there's gonna be room to iron those items out probably, especially as they get into the next round and find out what mechanical systems they're using, what grade finishes they're using and such. There's gonna be money moving around, but they do have contingencies in there that would go to traffic studies and all different items that you're gonna need.
Right, because I also believe as a town, we committed to doing traffic studies anytime we do a school building project, and we got hit with quite a high fee for those when we did the McCall
Right.
project. So
The whole
I
site.
just want to make sure we're accounting for that as part of Carriage House, because if we're doing Lynch, that's going to be part of the Lynch project. So when we're putting a building there, that building is already going to be included in that work. But if we're doing Carriage House, that's going to be a separate cost.
So you'd be pleased to know that the Lynch estimate that we throw around out there actually has a specific allocation for just what you described, which is that new town policy that the select board voted. I think the philosophy around the Carriage House was it's an existing building. The last time the Carriage House was occupied, it was a preschool and it was packed with kids. And there was more traffic coming to the Carriage House than there would be if central office occupies the Carriage House. So the amount of cars that come there obviously are a direct reflection on the usage and the tenants of the building, but we would expect, as I said earlier, most people are going to be arriving there before the school bell rings. There is some come and go during the day, of course, but we didn't really imagine that would have much of a direct impact on the pickup and drop-off procedure. It's more really just an acknowledgement that when it comes time for drop-off, there are some parking spaces back there that already have cars in them, and that's actually kind of important. I mean, what's the consequence of that? So we got to be sure we have space for teachers, and then if the society wants to have an event during the day, they need space, and so forth. And as Jay was talking, I was just trying to look through the detailed estimate to see if we actually had something in the line item. I agree with Jay. There are a tremendous number of allowances there that sort of get us from the construction cost to the soft cost. So that's something we would obviously want to look at a little more carefully in design development in terms of being clear what those allowances and contingencies are for.
Chris, could you clarify on the parking right now? How many spaces are there at Ambrose that are for the use of the school? And then what would that number be with this project? Would that number be steady? Would it increase? Would it decrease?
That's a great question. So I've never gone to count how many spaces there are like in the whole parking lot there. A quick comment, there are fewer spaces there today than there were when the building opened in 2006. Because in 2009, we dropped 2 modulars in the back of the building, and we did the same thing at Morocco. So I believe, Jay, when we put the modulars in there, I think we
We took
lost
parking spaces.
we
Yeah.
lost some parking spaces. So that was sort of the consequence of that. What I can tell you, what I can say is sort of relevant to your question perhaps, is that there is a lease. You've heard us talk about this lease. So once upon a time, the school department controlled the entire Ambrose campus. At some point, and I can't tell you when, back in certainly the 70s and the early 80s, central office main home was actually at the Sanborn House, like the mansion itself, and they moved on. At some point, the school committee surplused kind of the back half of the site. So there is an imaginary line. There's a huge mature, I think it's an oak tree, Michelle, or a maple. There's a big tree
Yeah.
in this green field, kind of between Ambrose and
the
Sanborn. There's a line, a property line now basically that is perpendicular to High Street that kind of runs towards the neighborhood. And so if you stand on High Street, you have Ambrose to the left, the Carriage House is sort of to the back but to the left, and everything to the right is town property. But long after that surplus was made, then the Historic Society came to the town and sought to engage in a long-term historic preservation lease. Would the town consider letting them call Sanborn House their home in exchange for a painstaking sort of restoration of the property? And that came to town meeting probably 10 or 12 years ago now, and that passed. But what's interesting is out of that big parcel of land that I described that the town now controls, the select board ultimately just carved out a piece for the society. So the Historic Society doesn't have a lease on everything from that beautiful tree I described, like down to Cambridge Street. They just kind of have a piece of it. And so there is a parcel of property that's not ours, and it's the town's, and it's under the control of the select board, and it's outside the lease with the Historic Society, if this makes sense. And though that lease, designates this area for future parking expansion because that was contemplated as necessary. The language in the lease actually says that the school committee, given the understanding that the needs of the schools and the dynamics of schools change from time to time, the school committee may need from time to time to claim some parking and to repurpose some parking. There is an agreement in the lease that I think it's 12 spaces or something are made available to the Historic Society. But as I read the lease, it also kind of preserves the right for us to, if you will, take that back. But I say that very quickly because as a practical matter, we obviously want to be good neighbors. And if we're going to renovate the carriage house, if we're going to bring traffic onto the site, the right thing to do is to provide some parking and to do it in the way that was always contemplated. So there's certainly been no conversation with the Historic Society about saying we're taking your parking. So I want to be very clear about that. But it's much more about saying, because we're kind of looking at common areas, what can we do to find a solution that works? Essentially, the solution that TAPE presented last week kind of takes that parking lot that exists today, right in front of the carriage house or in back of, depending upon how you want to consider it, and almost kind of duplicates it. There's a lot of slope, there's quite a bit of grade there, and it's sort of connected with a drive. That's one approach. The exciting thing is that the society had engaged with an architect and landscape architect that looked at a kind of different approach, different design approach, but in the same area, that actually produces much more parking. But it does this by sort of flattening the area, larger retaining wall, et cetera. So these are sort of the weeds that aren't really appropriate for this meeting, but that's exactly the kind of thing that I think we'd have to explore in design development, which is, okay, we got to provide more parking. Here was sort of the TAPE idea. Here was the society's idea. Do we take one and advance it? Is there a compromise, and so forth? That's a long answer, but I don't know how many spaces there are at Ambrose.
Yeah.
About 50.
My point is just I would want us to make sure that we're very clear about how many spaces Ambrose needs on an average day, and then I don't think they should be losing any as a result of this project, but I would just want to make that clear so everyone has an understanding and there's the ability to plan for that operationally for the school. All of a sudden, if you're losing 10-year
Right.
parking spaces, that's not a fun thing to find out on the first day back to school.
So I can offer this, that this project is not about taking spaces away, but actually adding parking to accommodate increased use. I have made a point over the past few days since school has been in session, when I'm in the area, and I just did this last week, I will drive onto the Ambrose campus and just kind of look back there. I never see more than 2 or 3 cars parked in that little lot behind the carriage house. And when I do see those 2 or 3 cars, I see more than 2 or 3 open spaces in the lot. So that just may be a reflection, that somebody parked there because the lot was full at another time. So we have to look at this carefully. My point is, if you go there during a regular school day, you're not going to see that lot is full. Because if that was the case, then that speaks to a different issue, which is we need to look even harder at some supplemental parking.
Right, the lot next to the carriage house, parents have been told not to park in. So
That's
that,
what?
But parents have been told not to park in at Ambrose. That's why you don't see people parking there.
Ah, got it.
So,
When we were visiting the site with, I think with TAP A, or maybe it was some of the early schematic design, Jay actually joined us out there. And what I appreciate about sort of our longer term veterans on EFPBC is they have some institutional memory. Do you want to just say a word about some of the investments that were made, like in electrical service when we did Ambrose and back
Before
in
we
2006?
paved Ambrose, we put conduits in from the street all the way down the new driveway to the carriage house, and knowing that something was gonna happen at one time. That was a change order to the Ambrose. So there's no reason to go backwards. And I believe the water main also is within 30, 40 feet of the Ambrose too, of the carriage house, so that's in good shape. We're not going all the way to the street. I don't even know if they reflected that in their latest budget. I was looking through it quickly to see if they made those changes, but I think they still have the conduit, everything going to the street for the services for telephone and electric.
Yeah, they picked it up. They picked
They
it
did
up.
pick
So
it up on the
I
last
just
one,
I
yeah.
want to thank Mr. Nardone because he saved us a bunch of money on this virtual project, because in the original version, the electrical engineer any engineer would have made the same assumption given what the building looks like. There's an overhead line that goes to Sanborn, but the initial recommendation was bring in a new overhead electrical service, and Jay said, why would we do that? There's a conduit right there, just pull one more conductor. And
Yeah, before we paved, we put that in to No, I think this has always been in the works to do something with that carriage house. From '06 when we did the Ambrose, there's always been something in the works.
Do you have any remarks just in the business right now about construction cost escalation? I mean, I think that's on the mind of a lot of school committee members, and you know, there's elements of construction we read about, like plywood went up 300% and then came down 60%.
All
I was
materials.
gonna say, but back down.
What's that?
I said, but it's back down.
Yeah.
It's gonna start trending down. I mean, I don't think if we put out to bid right now, that would work, that budget, but I think it will come, it is trending back down, but we are up 300% on raw materials, copper, steel. And labor's hard to get too. The interest is going to not be as interesting to bid that as it will be hopefully next year, by the time the drawings are done and everything's ironed out. So, again, it's a smaller job. It's gonna bring in a different group of contractors. It's gonna bring in the people like did the McCall addition, not, the heavy hitters that are gonna be after Lynch.
Mhm.
So, you're gonna get that group that does fire stations and small jobs all around to bid the carriage house. That's kinda like their wheelhouse, to get in quick jobs and get out, not to linger on a Lynch type project. So it might be more attractive to some of these people to get in and get the job done. You know, Lynch, they're in for the long run.
Yeah.
Between site and everything else, and it's a tough site. Just looking through, I think I'm 8 of the proposals so far, and just the ideas of how to set that school are all over the board. I mean, funky designs, everything else, so.
Just
tough site.
accessing the site with materials and lay down
Live- yeah.
areas is,
Yeah, the logistics is gonna be a nightmare to
Yeah.
write the logistics plan for that
Challenge. It's going to be a challenge.
challenge.
It's
gonna be
a challenge.
challenge that feels a little nightmarish.
Nightmares
Yeah.
will come later. It's a challenge.
It's gonna be tough.
It is.
In terms of timing, how this may play out, if the school committee wishes to designate the carriage house as the future permanent home, just remind the committee what we're asking for is, you know, a modest amount of money to kind of take this concept, take it one more step to address, for instance, the concerns of Ms. Bergstrom, and other, you know, questions that may be coming up from the community about, you know, particular issues. I know there's been a particular question about foundation, for instance. So like if either we have the answer or we don't, and if that's something we need to evaluate, you know, we look at that. In terms of timing, if this should be funded through fall town meeting, design development is not a terribly lengthy exercise for a project like this. I can imagine the design team would be ready to go sometime in November. I can imagine it's like a November, December, January exercise, and the outcome of that is important in terms of timing as we think about spring. And if this project, and we need to have conversations about how to pay for it, it seems the one obvious candidate would be some measure of a debt exclusion override, but whether it's expressly for this or if it's bundled with something else like we just did last spring. You know, we had a major flood the most expensive, you know, last flood mitigation project was tied to an investment in Morocco, and the response for that was very strong. So, you know, that was all in, forgive me, it was 11 million, right? 10 point something. Morocco was 3.6, and the flood mitigation piece I thought would be up to 10. We're bonding those on different schedules, but I want to say all in it was around 13 or 14 million dollars. Do I have that about right? If we add those two projects together, something like that. I'm looking at the former FinCom member, but I think I'm close. So, you know, at $6 million, is there an interest or appetite to bundle this with something, and what might that be? You know, if you're watching the select board meeting, you know there's strong interest in an important comprehensive renovation of the transfer station. But we also need, and there's clearly support for that at the select board table, but we have some significant needs for HVAC projects for the firefighters. We've got a lot of HVAC and air quality work to do at Town Hall for our municipal employees over there. And of course, that's another building the public accesses, you know, routinely. So I think for us to take this next step and really sharpen our pencils and be confident about this number and what it represents would really help us in a conversation with select board, FinCom, and ultimately town meeting around some spring question. And we could be ready as early as that. This obviously requires a broader conversation with folks who aren't here with us tonight, and I'm the first to acknowledge that. But if we were to pull that off by spring or summer, I think we can meet the schedule that TAP A outlined last week. Any scenario that moves Dr. Hacken and his team out of this building before we're building Lynch can be terribly helpful to us in terms of some measure of swing space. We're getting a lot of questions from architects who've been on the site and who've submitted proposals. They're very interested to understand what kind of swing space we have here, and they're intimating that something may be necessary. Certainly if we put, if we increase the size of Lynch by 8%, we're tipping the scale kind of the wrong way. And I thought Vivian made an interesting point last week at the meeting at the high school when we talked about modular classrooms. This idea that if in fact it should be determined, and we have a long way to go before we know this, but if it should be determined that really the simplest, best approach for a new Lynch is to move the entire student body out and build a new building like we did for VO, having this first floor available would be huge, and yet it doesn't accommodate all of the Lynch student body. But we have an opportunity to bring modulars on site and some cost avoidance because we can still use this space. So her comment about certain accessory spaces being in the building that can work to our advantage, I really hadn't thought about it at that level of detail. All just important things to be thinking about. The challenge still remains. We have a much clearer focus of what central office could look like at Carriage House than we do at Lynch. And that's unfortunately just sort of inescapable, because one is a very kind of schematic but comprehensive design with a cost estimate, and the other is much more of a master plan concept. Although I do appreciate Jay making the point that the proposals we're getting from architects make clear this is like building a ship it's like building an elementary school in a bottle is what it's like. Yeah.
It is.
So I actually had, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, along the line of timelines, could you also explain so that we all understand the timeline if we were looking at including central office in Lynch? Because I know that we have to make a decision by October 1. But then we also have the information that the MSBA will be making a decision on whether or not to include that by September 2022. So could you just go over the ramifications of that, the timeline and the ramifications?
And again, I would ask both Jay and Frank to weigh in on this, but the MSBA is it's a large organization, and I call it a modular organization because I like to talk about their modules, in the steps of the process, whether it's eligibility or feasibility, and within feasibility, one module after the other. So there are many boxes to be checked at steps along the way. It will be one of the first exercises when we do build the design team is to get on the space program. You all know what a space program is now because we talked about it, certainly ad nauseum with respect to central office, but we have to have a space program for the rest of the elementary school. And so it's the space program that the architect needs to even begin to do the work. So how does this building evolve? How can we place this building on the site? So really the first two pieces are going to be understanding the site, the opportunities on the site, the wetlands, the 100-year floodplain, etc., and then understanding the space program so that they can begin to solve the problem. So this deadline from Hill is simply because it is, if we were talking about something that might increase the size of the building by 0.5% or maybe 1%, I don't think it would be as big of a deal. This is a consequential decision because it has a real impact on how on the space program and how the design may evolve. I must tell you, I was not the only one who pushed back a little bit on the MSBA when they shared with us the date. They said it likely won't be until September of 22, just because a lot of time would have expired by then. But that's what they're holding to. My understanding is they will expect, just as when you go through feasibility, they expect you to look at multiple sites and multiple options. What they've indicated to us is that we're certainly welcome to include it in the program and make some progress towards that, but we ultimately have to make a presentation to them. We have to request it, basically, and say why we think the best fit is at Lynch, They will want to know what other options we looked at, and they need to be convinced that it makes the most sense at Lynch. And then back to Dr. Hackett's point earlier, not at the expense of the educational program and the assembly of spaces, the quality of it, how that building will perform. So essentially, I guess the project team's going to do a lot of work to try to make the case, but they've cautioned us, that sometimes they say no.
I would just add to that, I think it's almost flipping what you said. They don't want anything that's going to impact the school negatively. That is their priority. That's the business they're in. It will be our job to prove to them that central office in Lynch does not compromise anything with the site, anything with security, and anything with the educational program. So in my experience from other projects, it is relatively rare that they allow that unless you're talking about a 50-acre site that you're coming out of the ground new on, that serves other purposes. They've funded things like, or they have supported projects that have included community centers, for example, or senior kind of not living but center. I've seen them do that in different communities. Obviously, that community is paying for that, but that's again 50 acres of land to spread out on, a lot of community support. But it will not be an easy hurdle to get them to agree to have central office there.
And so just to get to that point, though, to make the case to them, you sort of have to show them. You have to show the MSBA that this isn't negatively impacting. So there's a lot of work to do, right, to get to that point and to show them. If they say no, then there is some redesign work that has to be done, because now you're taking that chunk out. Now, I have to assume that project teams who approach this issue with the MSBA already have, a good architect and a good design team has a plan B in mind. Otherwise you're just unprofessionally almost putting all your eggs in one basket. So I would have to assume, if we opt to say we'd rather it go to Lynch, that as the design is evolving, our design team would certainly be aware there's the prospect that they're going to say no. So in which case, we have to do without the design in some measure changes. But then we find ourselves sort of back where we are today, which is we need to find a permanent home for central office, and a year has gone by, and escalation has gone by, and the carriage house has deteriorated yet a little bit more. That's the best I can answer the question
I
about.
think you have to take into consideration too, when they're designing, putting the office there is a square footage on the main level. It's like if you were looking at the McCall addition, 3 levels, you're only, it's a nook stuck on the side of the building. You're not going to have 3-story central offices going up. So for them to place central office into that, and just looking at how difficult it is now, that's a clear 8% square footage that they have to, maybe they can go over it with a second floor, but it's going to be sizable. for
In
them
other
to-
words, it's
to fit.
vying for prime time space.
Exactly,
Yeah.
they have to fit that onto the lot, so they really need to know that, I think, going in, or pretty close to it. If it was a 3-story building and we were doing 2 rooms on each floor going up, you can almost put it anywhere, but to sit that on the first floor is gonna be a tough job on that site.
And why would it have to be on the first floor? The
Just
carriage
the
house wouldn't
access
be
stuff,
on front
it would
floor.
need it would need an elevator because it's accessible. And it
Right.
wouldn't share the elevator with the school, so it'd need its own elevator.
Right.
Otherwise, you'd have a corridor
Yeah.
kind of loading into, and you'd have people coming into an entrance in the school and going up to the offices if it was on the second floor. So it'd have its own entrances, its own staircase, its own elevator. It really needs to sit on the first floor to be cost effective.
And so
Can you do a
for,
2-sided elevator with lock-offs and key cards?
You
Just
probably could-
curious.
No, it's all a good point, but you're putting the elevator instead of central, you'd be sticking it to one side unless you put the offices in the center of the school, which is really bringing all the traffic into the same doors. It's not even a separate entrance.
Right.
I mean, anything's possible, but it's something that they have to design to,
Right.
and know. If that was a huge site, it would be no problem at all. Just a tough site to begin with.
and given what we know about Lynch today, so 91-ish thousand square feet, if you just say it's a 3-story school, kind of like VO, although the top
Right.
floor of VO is not quite as big as the others, but if you just divide that into thirds and say it's about 30,000 square feet per floor, if you looked at central office and said, okay, call it 8,000 square feet. We're not going to put you on 3 stories, but maybe, a chunk of it could be on the main level and a chunk could be above. So that's 4,000 each. So that's 4,000 square feet out of a floor plate that's 30. So that's still, that's over 10%, right, of a floor. And these early kind of concepts that the architects are sharing with us in their proposals, without question, everyone's already looking at you have to look at a multi-story solution. There's literally like no other way to do it to, preserve the building we have. I'm
Right.
sorry, I was stepping on you.
That's okay. I thought it was interesting what Dr. Hackett had said about does not impact the school negatively regarding Lynch. And I think our job is to make sure we don't impact the schools, our entire district negatively. So I do think there is we have to consider, the trade-offs. Some of the observations and just that I'm hearing and differences, and I'd said up front that for me it felt stacked in one direction, not meaning that in a negative way. That on one hand we're looking at existing footprints, existing buildings, and on the other we're looking at a building of a certain size or a building of a bigger size. So it's a bigger footprint on a small space, and so that was one of the things that I was considering when I thought about this. And the other, as you just mentioned, was this notion of displacing academic space. We're not saying let's add on to the side of Ambrose, or let's take part of Ambrose and put something in there. It's an existing footprint. So it's really about, as I'm hearing, it's about the usage and the traffic that may come through there, and whether the sequencing of the timing is going to work out, and things. And I guess that brings me to wondering, what our thoughts are around the carriage house. Should we not do it? Because we could we could rehab it and rent it to someone, but that seems like a worse option because then it's not kind of school district people using the place. That if a daycare is in there or whatever, it goes back to some other use. You have more traffic at less convenient times, at least based on the premise of central office might arrive or not during peak rush drop-off time, or you use it for the central office or you surplus it, which I know is an option out there. My sense is that it's not a I don't know. I guess for me, I feel like that's not really an option. That I know I wouldn't want to see the building be destroyed or put lots of money into having maintaining it as an empty shell. So then it comes back to what do we do with the building? And so that just in my mind, besides all the space constraints, I'll also just note, I thought Tape's presentation was very good, with one exception, which Michelle you caught when I repeated it, which was the lockdown issue. I think you were right on that, as I reflected on it. That if there was a significant event happening at Ambrose, I think it would affect that site as well. So I think that was more of a red herring. I think that I think the safety concerns that Mr. Nixon had talked about around really building a completely separate building inside of a building, it really equate to a cost thing, because I think wherever we do it, we'll make sure that there's a separate entrance, a separate access to all points of the building and all of that. And so it's I feel like it kind of nets out on that one, and I would take in my analysis of it, I would take the lockdown situation just off the table, because I think you're right. I think it's totally an issue at either place. So anyway, those are just my thoughts on the two different things. And last, let me just one more on the parking, because I think we shouldn't take spaces away from anyone. And I think that any design we do should provide the amount of parking that is needed for the building. So, and in fact, if we could squeeze a few extra spaces in, that would probably help accommodate some of these concerns. I will say, when I think about, it's hard for me to envision, the Lynch site, and actually at some point we can take it offline, but I'm kind of curious about what this part is. That
you should hold that up. That's now a public document, and I can tell you. So, Mr. I didn't know you were going to have that. You are holding the Lynch site. That's from our GIS survey.
Yeah, but
What's white is a well field, an old well field at the water department. That's not our property.
the field is on that, right? Or-
It's
or is that the
there's a
forest?
little bit of field on there. There's a lot of woods on there, and also the
Wooded.
floodplain also cuts through that. So one of the things, this is a great sort of visual diagram, because I think this is not the first time people will see this as we get into feasibility. We will have to evaluate whether we can we feasibly take a slice of that that's outside a conservation area, that's outside a 100-year floodplain, and can in some measure help us sort of site the building. But that very site diagram that Mr. Hopcroft's holding is what we looked at when we looked at the high school feasibility study. And in particular, we did look at that wellfield site, and it was basically, this was ruled out. That had so many issues attached to it that it basically wasn't helpful. Am I oversimplifying, Jay?
No,
Yeah,
you're right.
the building is right here. But yeah, so prior to even seeing this report, I thought this entire area was the Lynch site.
Ah.
And so the Lynch site like lost a third of it or a quarter of it. And so the thought of, adding 8% to a building, whatever the building is, and by the way, co-locating this building and another building, I don't even know, like, ooh, we stick it over here, I'd be curious to see some of those things, but and then adding, additional parking, it's, we have good architects, so if that's what we do, that's what, they'll find ways to do it, but anyway.
Lots of creative thinking coming.
There
Yeah.
is.
Okay, and then I guess I would just comment that I think there is interest in, and I believe we had expressed this at last week's meeting, that there is an interest in just seeing a side-by-side comparison as much as we can of how central office cost versus the Lynch inclusion in a Lynch elementary school cost going down the road, understanding that is hard to predict at this point.
Say the last part again.
Understanding that is that a lot of assumptions will be going into that, soft assumptions. So, but there's been interest expressed.
I think in
around
more
that.
detail than that report is.
More detail than the presentation, or more detail than the report that's been shared with the school committee? Because there's a conclusion section in the report
Right.
that seeks to do just what you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe maybe offline, what I might just ask is if I direct the school committee members back to I'm talking about the 130-page
Yep.
report. I think
This
you'll
one.
have links to that. Actually, if you don't mind, Mr. Hopcroft, just turn that page and hold your binder up there.
It's,
You had some.
Well, there's two.
Yeah.
There's a summary here,
The summary. Yep.
and then in here, there's a section on cost, which does some of the comparison, but obviously the hypothetical Lynch school doesn't have a lot of detail.
Yep.
Right.
So there's a lot of words in the report that sort of speaks to that. The words weren't sort of on the screen for obvious reasons in the PowerPoint. So I might ask the committee to take a look at it's literally called the summary of pros and cons. And so there's schedule, there's cost, design opportunities, and challenges. Take another look at that, and if there are any specific questions, or if you feel like there's some missing information, let us know, and then we'll get back to Tape and see what we can pull together, or Hill, depending upon what the nature of the question is.
Okay.
Can I ask Mr. Nixon one more
Yes.
question while we have him here?
Yes.
So, since I've learned everything I know about
Not leaving in
construction
5
from
minutes.
Mr. Nixon, while we still have you here on this topic,
Oh.
is there any, and Mr. Nardone can probably maybe answer this better too. This is a very short timeline. And all I know about construction right now is what I know from residential remodeling, and that those timelines are doubling and tripling in many cases in residential construction for this kind of work. Do you see these timelines as accurate,
They are accurate.
even
Materials-
given what we know about what's going on?
I think what you have to take in the time for design. So we're not going into this until spring, maybe out to bid in June. If everything went great, I don't know. And Material is an issue, but the group of contractors out there that take on these small projects, a lot of the small projects are on hold.
Right,
So there's contractors that are fit into all these different schedules. The fire stations aren't being built.
right.
There's a lot of stuff, so they're looking. So the niche is out there to do this. If you were to say, put this out to bid next week, I'd absolutely correct. There's no way this is gonna go. But if you spend the time to get it all, and really, if it goes out to bid and it doesn't hit the market, there's no harm to table it either for 6 months. The drawings are done, you have a budget, it doesn't hit the budget, they have to bond it, so they're not gonna take it on if they can't, not like a house where they just start the job, take a deposit and leave.
Right,
Someone's gonna put up a good-sized bond, and then start the job. So there's either gonna be no interest, which we'll know at the bid time because no one's gonna show up, and then table the job. I mean, the only thing that affects is the swing space for Lynch if it was taken in that we needed the swing space.
Yeah.
right, and I
If-
guess that was my concern of understanding the timelines and knowing what's happening in
Right.
construction right now. Is that part of this even advantageous to doing the carriage house, or are we gonna end up essentially on the same timeline as we would if we built it at Lynch?
We could. We don't know what's gonna happen over the winter,
Yeah,
except that material stuff is starting to move. It's very slowly, but it's better than 2 months ago. So, and it is gonna take time to get a budget and get it approved and get drawings made and get a bid package. We won't be seeing this till, early spring at the least, but I would be more like a June bid date.
Mhm.
I don't know what you're expecting, Chris.
Well, I think Tepe said in their report, in their presentation, I think they talked about summer/fall 23.
Move in.
In my mind, I do try to pad schedule early, so I like to think of fall 23 only because in my mind that's easy to then say, okay, that's 2 years ahead of Lynch, in terms of when Lynch would be done. But there's another important date to consider, and that is for a year and a half now, our target has been, in order to hit fall 25 for Lynch, we're assuming we're bidding the work. We're bidding Lynch sometime between like January or February of 24. So the point is that so that's the beginning of the 23 school year. Our current schedule was that we would have Lynch students in the building in the fall of 23. So, but this is all a little, this is subject to change. This is why you want to go
Right.
through feasibility. You get the OPM on, you get the architects, and remember, we lost some time last year between Thanksgiving and Christmas over the whole kind of design enrollment discussion with the MSBA. So the outcome of that was good because they significantly increased the design enrollment, but we lost some time. And back to that modular organization, if you pause for a moment to have a conversation, you literally, you get taken out of line. Some other district comes up and takes your spot. And that's what happened with us. That's why we saw a delay, almost I want to say a 7-week delay on the OPM side, and then we have to go through the OPM selection process, and now we're to the architects. We really have one more opportunity at this stage to claw back a little bit of time, and it remains to be seen if we will. So a year and a half ago, our hope was that we would have had the architects selected by July, that they would have been on site in August, looking at the site, and we'd be having visioning meetings, kind of around the same time as starting school. That obviously hasn't quite played out. Maybe that's okay, because everybody's primary focus is getting back in school, and we still have issues that we're working through on a daily basis, but we lost some time. We're going to have to work hard to find a way to claw it back. So my point in just saying that is, if there were if Carriage House wasn't ready by the summer of 23, I don't see that as a problem. If it's ready by fall of 23, that's frankly no earlier than when I thought it might be ready anyway. And if it's not ready till, December of 23, I don't see how that's a problem for the Lynch project either. But we're just we're ahead of ourselves, obviously. Other decisions need to be made. But in other words, it's a little squishy. I think there's some flexibility there.
right, but we're looking at the advantages of carriage house versus Lynch, and if timeline isn't an advantage either, then I'm trying to just work out what the clear advantages are to be able to communicate to the community of one project over the other.
Right. In other words, what the point I'm trying to make is, one needs to have a really clear understanding. Not only will we need some measure of swing space for Lynch, but when exactly do we
Right.
need it? So we will be making great progress on the new Lynch Elementary School with kids in that building, because we'll be in programming and schematic design, right, and conceptual design. And we have to go through a whole funding exercise, and we'll go to town meeting. We're going to have a debt exclusion override. So, just a couple of dates to remind people of, like, we built this incredible new elementary school up on the hill at VO, and it was open in September of 13. That building opened in September of 13. The debt exclusion override vote to pay for that project was on January 11th of 2011. My point is, there's a lot of work that gets done before you actually go and ask for the money to actually pay for the project. And when that gets funded, everything just starts going, like, it feels like 100 miles an hour.
And we need to approach the Lynch knowing if this is available for swing space or not.
Yeah.
It can't be up in the air. It needs to be the designing around that changes their whole look at the project. Are they, adaptive reuse of some of it? Do we have to put modules on that site? There's a lot to take into account. This would, a decision one way or another would at least direct the architects in which way they're going.
Right, which is why it's important to really understand the clear timelines on the carriage house and whether they're realistic or not. Because if we can't get that project done to get people out of here in time, then the advantage of swing space here is
gone.
lost as well.
Right.
So I
Absolutely.
wouldn't want to get into that project and then say, but we still need to rent millions of dollars worth of swing space because we can't get central office out of here.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so I think you heard, we could certainly, if there's a specific schedule question you want to circle back with TAPE on, I think we have time to do that. I think they put forward a schedule that in their estimation is reasonable. And, I appreciate Jay's sentiment as well. I certainly think it is. Thank you for the question.
Anything further? Otherwise, I will move us on to our next agenda item.
Jay, thank you very much for coming
Great.
tonight.
Have a good
Thanks,
day.
Jay.
Really
See you.
appreciate it.